On April 5th, 1933, the President of the United States did something that, in any other era, would have sounded insane. He turned ordinary savers into potential felons with a single signature. Franklin Roosevelt signed Executive Order 6102. Overnight, it became illegal for Americans to own most forms of gold, not just for banks, not just for speculators, for everyone. If you had gold coins, gold bars, or gold certificates, you had 30 days to hand them over to the Federal Reserve. Fail to obey, and you were looking at a $10,000 fine and up to 10 years in federal prison. 10 years in a cell for holding the very metal the dollar was supposedly backed by. Most people went along. They walked into banks with little cloth bags and metal boxes, slid their gold across the counter, and received paper dollars in return. The government paid them $20.67 per ounce, the official price that had been in place since the late 1800s. They didn't see it as a trap. They saw it as patriotic. America was broken. The Depression was raging. And they were told this was a temporary sacrifice to help rebuild the system. 9 months later, once Washington had vacuumed up the bulk of the country's private gold, the second move dropped. Roosevelt raised the official gold price to $35 per ounce, a jump of about 69% on paper, without miners pulling a single extra ounce out of the ground. In one move, the government effectively captured about 40% of the gold holders' wealth for itself, legally, with mass public cooperation. And the people who had surrendered their coins and bars couldn't even buy back in because gold ownership for citizens had just been turned into a crime. This is not some dusty footnote in a history textbook. This is a template, a playbook. And in different language, aimed at different assets, that playbook is being dusted off again in 2025. The tools have changed. The technology has changed. The targets have changed. But the underlying mechanism, confiscate, revalue, devalue the debt, and push the bill onto the public, is exactly the same. On January 23, 2025, President Trump signed an executive order creating a strategic Bitcoin reserve. Buried in that document are phrases that should sound eerily familiar: strategic asset, national security, acquisition authority, custody and management framework. This order is not about celebrating crypto. It's not about innovation or being number one in digital assets. It's the legal skeleton for something far more serious: the ability to seize, centralize, and then reprice the hardest assets that exist outside the traditional banking system, and use that revaluation to blow a hole in a $37 trillion mountain of government debt. And this time, it's not only about gold. It's about Bitcoin, crypto, and any hard asset they can drag inside the perimeter. In this video, I'm going to walk you through exactly how Executive Order 6102 worked in the 1930s, how the pattern is being adapted for 2025, what steps are already in motion, and, most importantly, what you have to understand before confiscation and revaluation become headlines instead of conspiracy theory, because once they flip that switch, you don't get to rewind. Either you're positioned or you get harvested. Let's go back to where the modern playbook was written, 1933. In early 1933, the United States was in freefall. 1 in 4 workers was unemployed. Thousands of banks had already failed. Credit was freezing. Trade was collapsing. Behind the scenes, the federal government was still carrying a heavy load of debt from World War I. Debt to GDP sat around 40% and climbing, a level that feels tame next to today's numbers. But remember, the dollar was tied to gold. Every dollar was supposed to represent a claim on a fixed amount of gold at $20.67 an ounce. That promise, which had made the currency trustworthy in good times, became a noose in bad times. As the Depression deepened, faith in banks evaporated. People yanked their deposits and asked for gold, not paper. They didn't care about banking theory. They cared about not being wiped out. Gold felt real. Paper felt fragile. So gold began to pour out of the banking system. The Federal Reserve's reserves shrank. Under the rules of the gold standard, the Fed couldn't just create endless new dollars. Expansion of the money supply was limited by how much gold it held. As reserves fell, the money supply contracted. That triggered brutal deflation. Prices dropped. Wages dropped. But debts didn't shrink. They became heavier because every remaining dollar was more valuable. The system was tearing itself apart. Roosevelt needed a way to smash the link between the dollar and gold without triggering a total collapse in confidence. He couldn't simply go on radio and say, "We're dumping the gold standard." That would have looked like admitting defeat. So instead, he flipped the script. He took control of the gold first. Executive Order 6102 ordered all persons to deliver almost all forms of gold coin, bullion, and certificates to a Federal Reserve Bank by May 1st, 1933. There were narrow exceptions. A small personal allowance, gold used in industrial trades like jewelry and dentistry. But if you were a normal saver who had put wealth into gold, your options were simple: hand it in or become a criminal. The penalties were brutal for the time. Fines up to $10,000 and up to 10 years in prison. Adjusted for today's money, that fine would run well into the hundreds of thousands of dollars. This was not some gentle suggestion, it was coercion with a patriotic wrapper. Most Americans went along. They felt they had no realistic choice, and they still believed their government was acting in good faith. The story they were sold was simple. This is temporary. This is an emergency. This is how we save the banking system. They had no idea what step 2 would be. After the May 1st deadline, once the bulk of the private gold had been vacuumed up, the government paused. It waited out the immediate panic. Then, in January 1934, came the Gold Reserve Act. That law changed the game in 2 key ways. First, it moved the Federal Reserve's gold into the direct ownership of the U.S. Treasury. In other words, almost all the gold in America was now officially the government's property. Second, it gave the president the power to change the official conversion rate between dollars and gold. Roosevelt wasted no time. He reset the official gold price to $35 per ounce. That was a 69% jump from $67. Now look at what that meant in hard numbers. The Treasury held roughly 195 million ounces of gold. At the old price, that hoard was valued around $4 billion. At the new price, it was suddenly worth about $6.8 billion without discovering a single new mine. The government had magicked roughly $2.8 billion of balance sheet value into existence. In 1934, $2.8 billion was gigantic. The total federal budget that year was around $6.5 billion. More importantly, this move quietly attacked the debt. The obligations the government owed were denominated in dollars. When the dollar was devalued against gold, when it now took more dollars to buy an ounce, the real burden of those debts dropped. Roughly 40% of the debt's purchasing power simply vanished. There was no loud, messy default. On paper, every creditor still held full claims. In reality, those claims were now payable in weaker dollars. Where did that 40% go? It came from the pockets of the people who had surrendered their gold for $20.67 and missed the 69% upside. They couldn't even re-enter the trade. After Executive Order 6102, Americans were barred from owning monetary gold. That ban lingered until 1974, 4 decades, in which the state sat atop one of the largest gold hoards in history, while the people who used to own it watched their purchasing power erode. Inflation finished the job. Between the devaluation and the price rises that followed, Americans who had obediently turned in their gold saw the real value of their savings gutted by 60% or more. This wasn't some accidental byproduct of policy. This was the mechanism: confiscate, revalue, inflate, transfer wealth from citizens to the state, and shrink the real debt. It worked perfectly. Now put that template next to today's numbers. Right now, the U.S. government owes about $37 trillion. Debt to GDP sits around 132%. In 1933, at roughly 40%, Washington already felt desperate enough to criminalize gold ownership. Today, the ratio is more than triple and climbing. Annual interest on that debt is already in the ballpark of $1.2 trillion. That's more than the defense budget, more than Medicare. If interest rates stay near current levels, those interest costs could blow out toward $1.8 trillion by 2027. You cannot fix that with normal tools. You don't tax your way out of 132% debt to GDP. The economy produces around $28 trillion in GDP. Even if you could somehow confiscate the entire economy's output for a year, which you can you still wouldn't solve the problem. You can't grow your way out either, because the debt is compounding faster than the economy. And you can't slash your way out, because interest alone is eating a larger and larger share of the budget. When you strip away the slogans, there's one historical move left. The same one Roosevelt used. Take the assets that can't be printed, centralize them, change their official price, vaporize a chunk of the debt by destroying the currency's purchasing power, and capturing the upside of those assets on the state's balance sheet. The only difference now is which assets sit outside the system. In 1933, it was gold. In 2025, it's gold and Bitcoin, and broader crypto, and other hard assets that live beyond the direct reach of central banks. The Strategic Bitcoin Reserve Order is phase 1 of that process. Phase 1, write the rules. The first step is legal, not financial. You redefine what the asset is. The 2025 order labels Bitcoin as a strategic asset tied to national security. It grants the Treasury explicit authority to acquire, hold, and manage Bitcoin and related digital assets. It tells federal agencies to build policies, standards, and infrastructure for digital asset custody and regulation. That might sound boring. It isn't. Once something is moved into the national security bucket, the government unlocks a playbook of emergency powers. What would be extreme in normal times becomes necessary. When spoken in the language of security and stability, the stage is already complete. The definitions are on paper. The authorities exist. The strategic reserve is now an official concept, not a YouTube theory. Phase 2. Accumulate quietly and map the terrain. The second step is to build a stockpile and a map. The U.S. government already holds a large trove of Bitcoin from seizures, Silk Road, ransomware takedowns, and other criminal cases. It doesn't need to chase the market with open buy orders. It can add to that pile through forfeiture, settlements, and other legal pipelines without bidding the price to the moon. It can also use its own energy footprint to mine. Federal entities control dams, nuclear plants, and vast energy resources. Those can be turned into Bitcoin production at extremely low marginal cost if needed. At the same time, the data net tightens. Exchanges report transactions and balances. New IRS rules require detailed disclosures on digital asset activity. Custodians and brokers collect KYC data. Wallets connected to exchanges are linked to real-world identities. This is where the 1933 comparison becomes terrifying. Back then, gold was physical. It could be hidden in walls, buried in fields, smuggled across borders. The government knew some people had gold, but not exactly who, where, and how much. Bitcoin is different. The blockchain is a public ledger. Every transaction is recorded forever. And every time an American bought Bitcoin through a regulated exchange, that purchase was tied to their name, social security number, and bank account. Coinbase has that data. Kraken has it. Every KYC exchange does. And under existing law, that information is already flowing to the IRS and other agencies. There is no need for gold sniffing raids. There are spreadsheets. Phase 3. Turn voluntary into mandatory. Once the legal structure is in place and enough groundwork is laid, the next move requires a pretext, a crisis. It doesn't matter exactly what form it takes. A brutal debt ceiling showdown, a bond market revolt, a credit downgrade that scares foreign buyers, a sudden spike in yields as investors demand a higher return for holding U.S. bonds, a run on the dollar. In that environment, political actors can walk out to a podium and say that extraordinary measures are required to restore confidence and protect stability. One of those measures will be a mandatory transfer of certain digital asset holdings to the state. Maybe the rule is any U.S. citizen or entity with more than one Bitcoin must sell the excess to the Treasury. Maybe the line is 10 Bitcoin. Maybe it's defined in dollar terms across all digital assets. The exact threshold doesn't matter as much as the principle. Above a certain line, your holdings are no longer fully yours. And the sale isn't at market. It's at an official acquisition price set by the government. That number can be pitched as generous, $50,000, $80,000, $100,000 per coin, but still sit well below the free market price. Penalties for refusing would be harsh. Criminal charges, asset freezes, seizure of other property. And unlike 1933, the authorities don't start from a position of ignorance. They have detailed purchase histories, tax reports, and blockchain analysis. They can send a letter that says, "We know you acquired 4.7 Bitcoin on these dates. You have 30 days to comply with the mandatory sale. Failure to do so is a felony." Presented with that choice, most people will hand over their coins. Phase 4. Reprice and reset. After enough Bitcoin has been consolidated in the strategic reserve, perhaps 1 million coins, as some proposals have suggested, the revaluation lever gets pulled. The Treasury announces a new reference price for Bitcoin on the national balance sheet. It doesn't have to match the market immediately. It just has to be high enough to dramatically change the optics of the government's asset base versus its liabilities. Maybe that number is $500,000 per coin. Maybe it's $1,000,000. At $1 million each, 1 million coins become $1 trillion in state-held assets. Combine that with a sharp upward repricing of official gold reserves and other strategic assets, and suddenly the government can point to several $1 trillion of coverage against its obligations. On spreadsheets, the debt burden looks much less lethal. Rating agencies calm down, bond markets breathe, politicians declare victory. But what does that mean for everyone else? As the world's largest holder of Bitcoin declares a high reference price and backs it with policy, the market will eventually adjust upward. From the perspective of the average person, it looks like Bitcoin is exploding. In reality, what's happening is that the currency they're measuring it in, the dollar, is imploding. If one Bitcoin moves from $100,000 to $1,000,000, that's a 90% decline in the dollar's value relative to that benchmark. That erosion doesn't stay confined to a chart on Twitter. It shows up in grocery aisles, rent payments, utility bills. Inflation stops being an annoying 3-5% and becomes 20, 30, 50% per year. Dollars melt. The government's debt, however, is denominated in those same melting dollars. Each future coupon payment becomes cheaper in real terms. What looked unpayable at today's purchasing power becomes survivable in tomorrow's weaker currency. If you were forced to sell your Bitcoin to the Treasury at the official acquisition price on the way up, you don't participate in that revaluation. The gap between what you were paid and what the state later says those coins are worth for its own balance sheet That is the wealth transfer from you to them. It is 1933 in digital form. Now zoom out and look at the timeline this logic implies. 2025, quiet build-out. This year is about frameworks and plumbing. The strategic reserve is created on paper. Bitcoin already seized by law enforcement becomes a seed stockpile. Additional coins are gathered via seizures, settlements, and low-visibility acquisition. Regulators roll out reporting requirements that force exchanges and brokers to send more detailed data. Agencies design custody standards and compliance rules. To the average person, this looks like boring bureaucracy. In reality, it's the scaffolding for a future grab. 2026, the stress test. At some point, the illusion that debt doesn't matter shatters. Maybe it's a vicious debt ceiling battle. Maybe it's a failed bond auction. Maybe it's a foreign dumping episode. However it breaks, yields rise, markets wobble, and suddenly the words default, downgrade, and crisis of confidence are everywhere. In that moment, measures that were unthinkable in 2024 become reluctantly necessary. Just like the Patriot Act after 9/11, just like the emergency programs after 2008. When fear is high, lines move fast. 2027, confiscation and revaluation. This is when the switch flips. The government announces a mandatory acquisition program for Bitcoin and possibly other digital assets above certain thresholds. Official prices are declared. Exchanges and custodians are ordered to freeze, transfer, or liquidate assets into the treasury. Letters are mailed. Threats are made. Most people comply because they know their holdings are already visible. Once enough has been consolidated, the revaluation move happens. Bitcoin is assigned a sky-high reference price on the national balance sheet. Gold's official value is raised sharply. The dollar is deliberately pushed down. Inflation rips. Debts, in real terms, are slashed. 2028, after the shock. By 2028, the dust settles into a new reality. The dollar has lost the majority of its purchasing power compared to a decade earlier. Prices are permanently higher. The middle class that trusted the system, kept savings in dollars, held assets inside the structures that could be frozen, complied with every order, has been hollowed out. The state, however, is still standing. Its balance sheet is padded with revalued hard assets. Its debt, though still enormous on paper, is much smaller in real terms. The same pattern as 1933, different tools, same outcome. So what does someone do in the shadow of a playbook like this? The first step is understanding what they can easily grab and what is harder to reach. Anything held on a regulated, centralized platform is low-hanging fruit. If your Bitcoin sits on a big exchange, Coinbase, Kraken, Binance US, Gemini, or inside a spot ETF or custodied product, it's effectively inside the blast radius. The government doesn't need to find you personally. It can simply order institutions to freeze or liquidate those positions and credit you with dollars at the official price. The same goes for other digital assets that live inside tightly regulated wrappers. If it can be flipped with a policy memo and a phone call, it is a prime target. What's harder to seize are assets you control directly, outside custodial structures, in ways that don't leave obvious, up-to-date databases. In the crypto world, that means coins held in self-custody, hardware wallets, air-gapped devices, setups where you hold the keys and no intermediary stands in the middle. If those coins were acquired peer-to-peer, mined, or sourced via rails that didn't require KYC, they don't appear in the same neat lists that exchanges can hand over. That doesn't make them magically immune to law, but it changes the enforcement reality. It's the digital version of families burying coins under floorboards in the 1930s. The state can threaten. It can demand declarations. But it can't seize what it can't see without a huge amount of work. That said, the harsh truth is that most people did, and do, buy through exchanges. Their names, addresses, and transaction histories are already sitting in servers, so the practical survival steps are uncomfortable, not glamorous. Get assets off custodial platforms and into self-custody while that is still easy. Understand how to hold your own keys safely. Accept that once you do that, there is a trade-off. You gain sovereignty, but you also become your own backstop. There's no forgot password customer support for a seed phrase. For new accumulation, understand the difference between KYC and non-KYC channels. Peer-to-peer trades, small limit ATMs, and mining don't create the same neat databases that big exchanges do. That doesn't mean they're invisible forever, and nothing here is legal advice. But knowing the terrain matters. Think beyond one country. Confiscation risk is not uniform across the world. Some jurisdictions have long histories of strong property rights and more resistance to asset grabs. Others don't. Wealthy families have always used international diversification, trusts, foreign entities, cross-border holdings, to avoid letting any single government have total control over their balance sheet. Physical assets still matter. Gold stored outside the banking system, private vaults, secure non-bank facilities, or well-planned home storage, is less vulnerable than gold in a bank-safe deposit box that can be opened and inventoried by order. Productive land, real estate, and operating businesses that generate cash flow may rise in price as currencies weaken. They aren't immune from tax and regulation, but they can be frozen with a single click in the same way a brokerage account can. And then there's the psychology of enforcement. In 1933, the penalties for ignoring Executive Order 6102 were brutal on paper, massive fines and long prison terms. Yet actual prosecutions were relatively rare. The government simply didn't have the manpower to chase down every hidden coin. The system relied on fear and voluntary compliance, not on jailing millions of people. The same pattern is likely in the digital era. If and when a confiscation order hits, authorities will talk about maximum penalties. They'll make examples of a few people. But mass enforcement against every individual is logistically impossible. The real weapon will be perceived risk combined with easily accessible assets. If your holdings are sitting in a KYC exchange or ETF, you're an easy target. If they're in robust self-custody and you haven't advertised them to the world, the calculus looks different. None of this is a recommendation to break the law. It's a recognition of how enforcement actually works in the real world. People will push back on this scenario with three main objections. The first, they'd never do this. It would kill innovation. America would fall behind China and other competitors. That argument assumes governments prioritize innovation over survival. They don't. When the choice is between losing reserve currency status and upsetting some tech investors, they will burn innovation to the ground. When the choice is between defaulting openly on $37 trillion of debt or quietly eroding it through confiscation and inflation, they will choose the latter every time. Foreign rivals didn't stop the U.S. from shutting the gold window in 1971. They didn't stop unprecedented money printing in 2020. They wanted to stop asset grabs if those are seen as necessary to keep the system alive. The second objection, Bitcoin is decentralized. They can't control it like gold. Bitcoin's protocol is decentralized. The network doesn't shut down because a president signs a paper, but ownership in the United States is highly centralized in databases and regulated institutions. Every major exchange has your passport, your address, your transaction history. The IRS has 1099 forms. The blockchain makes flows between wallets public. Decentralization protects the network. It does not automatically protect individual holders whose identities are already tied to their coins. If the state can't turn off Bitcoin, it can still make your life extremely painful if you refuse to turn over coins it knows you bought. The third objection, the political backlash would be massive. They'd never get away with it. There was backlash in 1933 when gold was outlawed. It still happened. There was backlash to money printing and lockdowns in 2020. The program still went ahead. There was fury over bank bailouts in 28. The rescues still got done. Governments under existential financial stress do what they believe they must do, then spin it as necessary and temporary. The protests come later. By the time public anger reaches a boiling point, the assets are already in government hands, and the revaluation is already on the books. Here's the bigger picture almost nobody wants to look at directly. This isn't really about Bitcoin, or gold, or any single asset. It's about the endgame of a monetary system that has been stretched as far as it can go. The dollar's role as global reserve currency is under pressure. The debt stack is past the point of honest repayment. Central banks are loading up on gold. Countries are experimenting with alternative payment systems and new blocks. The people in charge are not stupid. They see the wall approaching. Confiscation and revaluation are simply the cleanest way for them to cross that wall without saying the forbidden word, default. In 1933, citizens who trusted the story, turned in their gold, and sat in dollars for decades were quietly ruined. The people who hedged, who held hard assets, who moved wealth outside easy reach, who didn't accept temporary emergency at face value, came through the reset with purchasing power intact. The same divide is forming now. There will be people who keep their wealth inside the most convenient, most trackable, most confiscation-friendly structures. They'll hold dollars. They'll hold custodial crypto. They'll hold assets that can be frozen with a policy memo. They'll believe the line that this is for stability and we're all in this together. And there will be people who study 1933 who recognize the pattern in 2025 and who decide not to stand in the same place when the next blast hits. They'll hold self-custodied digital assets. They'll own physical gold outside bank vaults. They'll build positions in real assets that benefit from currency decay. They'll diversify across borders. I'm not here to tell you what to buy or sell. This isn't financial advice. It's pattern recognition. Executive Order 6102 was the test run. It confiscated gold, revalued it, and used that gap to erase debt while hollowing out the middle class. The Strategic Bitcoin Reserve Order is the digital echo. The words are similar, the pressures are worse, the tracking is far more advanced. The legal framework exists, the databases of owners exist, the debt math is inescapable. The likely window is 2025 to 2027. By the time a mandatory sale order hits your inbox, by the time exchanges announce involuntary transfers, By the time the official revaluation is televised, your choices will be gone. You don't have decades. You have a shrinking window to decide whether you want to stand on the same side of the line as the compliant gold holders of 1933, or on the side of the people history forgot to warn you about, the ones who saw it coming and positioned accordingly.